Darkest reality: fathers selling their daughters in ancient Greece. It's not uncommon to hear about parents selling their children these days, but it wasn't always this way. In fact, it was once illegal to sell your kid in many countries around the world. But did you know that back in ancient Greece, this was a normal thing? To them, it was just another transaction, like buying and selling groceries at the market. You'd be surprised by how common it was for fathers to sell their kids and how easy they could do it. So let's take a closer look into this dark reality of ancient Greece. Ancient Greek culture is often viewed as being very advanced for its time. They had philosophers and scientists who made groundbreaking discoveries, and they developed some of the first forms of democracy and rule of law. However, there was also a darker side to ancient Greek culture that is often overlooked. One of the most disturbing aspects of ancient Greek society was the practice of selling daughters into marriage. In most cases, this meant that the daughter would be sold into marriage with a stranger. The bride price was typically paid in the form of money or property, and the bride's family would then use this money to benefit themselves. For example, they might use it to pay for a dowry for one of their other daughters or to improve their social status. The bride price was also sometimes used to support the bride's husband and his family. This was especially common if the husband was a young man who was not yet able to support himself. In some cases, a woman could refuse to accept her arranged marriage. However, this was rare, and the woman would often face severe punishment if she tried to resist. She may be beaten or killed, and her family would likely disallow her to marry anyone else. It's important to note that not all marriages in ancient Greece were unhappy. Many women were able to find love and happiness with their husbands, and some even went on to have successful careers as philosophers or scientists. However, this was not the norm, and most women's lives were controlled by men. They were forced to obey their father's wishes, and they had little say in who they married. The practice of selling daughters into marriage was not unique to ancient Greece. It was common throughout the ancient world. However, the Greeks took this practice to a whole new level. They developed a sophisticated system for buying and selling brides that resembled the stock market. In fact, the Greek word for wife, goon, was derived from the word for exchange. This shows how important the bride price was in Greek culture. In ancient Athens, a special market called the flesh market was created where men could come to buy brides. This is where the infamous phrase, "she's worth her weight in gold," originated. Brides were literally bought and sold like gold, and the price of a bride could vary depending on her age, beauty, and social status. A beautiful young virgin could fetch a very high price, while an older woman or someone with a lower social status would be much cheaper. One of the most famous examples of a bride being sold in ancient Greece is the story of Helen of Troy. Helen was the wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta. However, she was so beautiful that the Trojan prince Paris was willing to start a war to win her hand in marriage. Paris kidnapped Helen and took her back to Troy. This act of elopement sparked the Trojan War, which lasted for 10 years. Of course, not everyone could afford to buy a bride. In fact, most people were too poor to do so. This led to a black market for brides where women were kidnapped and taken advantage of. However, the authorities did very little to stop this practice because it was seen as an acceptable way of getting married. In fact, kidnapping was sometimes encouraged because it allowed a man to marry a woman he might not have been able to afford otherwise. It's important to note that not all women were sold into marriage. Some women were also sold into slavery. In fact, slavery was widespread in ancient Greece, and there were many different ways that a person could become a slave. Some slaves were captured in war, while others were born into slavery. Slaves were considered to be property, and they had no rights. They were often treated very harshly, and many died young due to overwork or abuse. Now let's see what kind of prices these girls were actually sold for. But before we move on, please support us by leaving a thumbs up and subscribing to our channel. You can also enter the chat to talk with us and other history lovers. When you think of the ancient Greeks, you probably imagine a civilization that was obsessed with beauty and perfection. After all, they're the ones who created the Olympics, where athletes from all over the Mediterranean competed in a variety of events to prove their strength and skill. But looks weren't everything in ancient Greek culture. In fact, there was a lot more to these ancient people than met the eye. According to historians, the price of a girl in ancient Greece could range anywhere from 50 to 300 talents of silver. 50 talents of silver would be equal to the value of 1,700 pounds of silver. So if we were to convert that into today's money, it would equal roughly $680,000. Of course, this price tag could vary depending on the quality of the girl. For example, a beautiful virgin could fetch a much higher price than a woman who was less attractive or older. However, it's important to note that the vast majority of transactions involve girls who were around 14 or 15 years old. This is because ancient Greece had a very different view of childhood than we do today. Children were considered to be adults in training, and they were expected to behave in a mature manner. In fact, girls could be married as young as 12 or 13 years old. That being said, there were also cases of men buying girls who were much younger. There are records of men purchasing girls as young as 7 years old. These men were typically wealthy and powerful individuals who could afford to buy whatever they wanted. As you can imagine, the market for young girls was highly competitive, and there were often multiple buyers interested in the same person. This led to a situation where the price of a girl could fluctuate wildly depending on supply and demand. In times of peace, when there was a surplus of women on the market, prices were typically lower. However, during wartime, when men were in desperate need of brides, prices could skyrocket. In addition to the price of the girl herself, there were also expenses associated with the wedding ceremony. This included costs for food, drink, music, and entertainment. As a result, the total cost of purchasing a wife could easily reach several $1,000s in today's money. Despite the expense, many men felt that it was worth the investment. After all, a wife was seen as a valuable asset, both economically and socially. She would help to run the household and take care of the children, which allowed the man to focus on his career. In addition, a successful marriage could bring a lot of prestige to the family name. It's clear that the practice of selling daughters and buying brides was a major part of life in ancient Greece. It's a dark and disturbing chapter of history that makes us question the morals and values of these ancient people. While it's true that some women found happiness in marriage, it was by no means the norm. Most women were simply bought and sold like commodities, with their lives controlled by men. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with our latest releases. We hope you'll join us next time for more fascinating historical tales.